So welcome everyone. This is, as I mentioned before, we are from Think Company. For those of you who don't know anything about us, we are an experienced design and technology consulting firm headquartered in Philadelphia, although we have designers working in studios and locations all around the country. We have, since quarantine started, we've been taking a lot of the normal public talks that we do at various events into a webinar format. It's been very popular. We try to do one a week or one every other week. And so this is part of a series of talks that Dave Thomas has done. And so we're going to hand that off to him in a couple of seconds. But before we get to that, just a few things. For those of you who are out there who may be affiliated with or may know some frontline organizations that are dealing with challenges around COVID-19, we are offering free problem-solving workshops for frontline organizations in those situations. All you have to do is apply through our website. So if you go to our homepage, thinkcompany.com, you'll find a card on there around that looks similar to this around problem-solving workshops for frontline organizations. You fill out an application form. We will review them and evaluate them and reach out to you if you fit some of our criteria for doing those workshops for you. So we hope to get some information from some organizations, and we've already got a lot of interest, and we're vetting some proposals from folks already. As far as future workshops are concerned, the first thing to talk about, which is really exciting, is we have two folks speaking at Confab. Confab starts May 18th to the 20th. You can go to confabevents.com to learn a little bit more about that. Our very own Dave Thomas, you're going to hear speaking here, is going to be doing a talk on conversation design to save civil discourse. And also Colleen Reese is going to be talking about optimization and idleness and why content strategists should do less. So Confab is a fully virtual conference, and Dave, I believe it's still open. I don't think it's.
Oh yeah, taking registration still.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's one of the great things about online webinars is you're not limited by the size of the space. You're taking up electrons, so there's plenty more space for people to sign up. So sign up for Confab if you haven't already. That'd be great to see you over there. Next week, we're going to be doing a talk on why your design system isn't working. We had a really popular talk a few weeks ago by Sean Hickman on just essentially the basics of design systems. And now he's going to be partnering up with Amanda Kalk, who's one of our development leads, to talk about the technological and the design sides of challenges in design system work. So I'm really excited about this workshop. I'm probably going to learn a few things when I host it. So it'll be great to have Sean and Amanda talking. Just a couple of ground rules about the webinar if you haven't attended one of these webinars for us in the past. Number one, you are all muted by default. That's the way the webinar platform works. We will start live Q&A around 3:45 today. We can go as long as 4:30 if folks want to stay. So sometimes we've had pretty great conversations following the talk. And so a lot of people need to bug out by 4 o'clock, but we can go all the way up to 4:30. We do record these webinars, so even if you have to leave at 4 and you want to see the end Q&A session, you'll get a link to that in an email after the session. During the session, please post any questions that you have within the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. People tend to, for some reason, put questions into chat. We try to push them over to Q&A when they do that. But chat is a great place to have discussions as well, but Q&A is where we're going to be managing all the questions for the Q&A session. I'll be monitoring Q&A. I'll choose questions for that session at the end when Dave opens up the Q&A session. If you leave yourself identifiable when you post the question, then I will unmute you and see if you can, some people have their microphones off or aren't interested in asking the question. So if that's the case, then I'll ask the question for you. But, and you can always post your question anonymously. But if you want to, we can unmute you and you can have more of a conversation with Dave as opposed to just us reading your question out loud. That seems to work out really well. Based on time, we may not get to all of the questions. It's only happened a couple of times, but we try to get to all the questions if we can. And there are moderators in chat and Q&A, so we can engage with you over there if you're running into any kinds of challenges. Let us know, probably in chat. Q&A is where you're just posting questions for Dave in the future. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Dave Thomas. He's a content strategy advocate at Think Company. He's the former host of the Cognitive Bias podcast, where he's developed a lot of the content and ideas around this talk. He's been a frequent speaker and he's also the author of the upcoming book Design for Cognitive Bias, which is being released soon through A Book Apart. I think that's released in July, Dave?
Yeah, that's our target date.
Great. So it's coming out in July, so you should look forward to that. And without any further ado, I'm going to hand everything over to Dave.
Thanks so much. So, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and boom. Can everyone see my screen? I'm going to hope that you can. So yeah, just going to move a couple of Zoom things around so I can see what's up. Excellent. So thank you all for coming out. Welcome to Design for Cognitive Bias, using mental shortcuts for good instead of evil. We can certainly talk about how to use them for evil, but that's a different talk. We'll do some other time. If you like to tweet during these things, we like to use the hashtag #FightBias. And my name is David Dylan Thomas. I am a content strategy advocate here at Think Company. And as Phil said, I'm also the host of the Cognitive Bias podcast, which is a podcast about, wait for it, cognitive bias. So I kind of want to talk about how I came to be the host of this podcast. And it all started with Iris Bonnet, who gave an amazing talk at South by Southwest a few years ago called Gender Equality by Design. And you should absolutely check this talk out. I wouldn't even be offended if you left right now to watch it. It's amazing. But the upshot of it was she was identifying a lot of very, bad behavior, like, gender bias in resumes or racial bias in pattern recognition. By which I mean, let's say you're hiring a web developer and maybe the first image that pops into your head is skinny white dude. And it's not because you explicitly believe that skinny white dudes are better programmers. It's just that that's the pattern that you've seen in movies and television, in offices where you've worked. And so when you see a name at the top of a resume that doesn't quite fit that pattern, unconsciously, you start kind of giving it the side eye. So when I realized that such pernicious behavior as racial and gender bias can come down to something as ordinary and, dare I say, human as pattern recognition, I decided I needed to learn everything I possibly could about cognitive bias. And so I did. This is the Rational Wiki page of cognitive biases. There's well over 100 of them. And I realized at a glance I was not going to figure all of this out overnight. So I looked at one a day for like a year. I just would look up one and read about it. And this turned me into the guy who wouldn't shut up about cognitive bias. And eventually my friends were like, Dave, please just get a podcast. So that's what I did. Now it's probably worth identifying what is cognitive bias. And a simple definition is it's a series of shortcuts your mind is taking. You have to make something like 1 trillion decisions in a day. Even right now, I'm making decisions about where to put my gaze and how fast to talk and what to do with my hands, right? And if I had to think carefully about every single one of these decisions, I would just, dissolve into a puddle of goo, right? I would never get anything done. So fortunately for us, most of our lives are run on this autopilot with all these shortcuts. Most of the time, this is fine, but sometimes those shortcuts lead us to errors, and we call those errors cognitive biases. And one of my favorites is called illusion of control. So imagine that you're playing a game where you have to roll a die. If you have to roll a high number, you'll throw that die really hard. If you need a low number, you'll roll it really gently. And everybody on this call knows it makes absolutely no difference how hard you throw the die, but we like to believe that we have control over situations we have no control over. And so we embody that by how we throw the die. Another fun one is survivorship bias. And it's basically the idea of we kind of judge the outcome by the winners and kind of ignore the losers. So a great example of this comes from a guy named Abraham Wald, who was a brilliant mathematician, PhD in Austria. And he was there when the Germans moved in, and he was Jewish, so he had to leave. He fortunately was able to get out and emigrate to America. So this mathematician refugee is brought in to help the army figure out, hey, we got all these planes getting shot down. We need to add more armor. Where should we add more armor so that they don't get shot down so much? And he's in the room with a bunch of scientists. They're all looking at these actual planes. And the scientists, for the most part, are saying, well, where you see all these bullet holes, and that is where you should be adding more armament. And our friend Abraham takes one look at that and says, yeah, no, you should be putting it exactly where you don't see the bullet holes. He realized that the planes they were looking at were shot up, but not so bad that they couldn't actually make it back. They needed to worry about the planes that got shot up so bad they went down. And those were clearly shot where you don't see the bullet holes. They were judging the outcome by the survivors, and they weren't thinking about the losers. We see this all the time in like entrepreneurial circles where it's like, oh, look at that person who made that, big win and sold their company for blah, blah, blah. And you forget about the 15,000 other people who tried the exact same thing and failed. I think this is a really important one to think about as designers, because I remember my very first web design was for a sports retailer. And I was doing the content strategy for the homepage. And I was convinced that we had made the most beautiful design ever, and the client was going to love it. And the client didn't love it. And it was about 5 or 6 versions later before we settled on something they liked. And I started to realize, wait a minute, the web that I go through every single day is full of 5th or 6th choices, right? Nothing is as originally planned. In fact, the whole built world around us is made up of things that made it through committee and fit into the budget. None of it was perfectly crafted and is the first draft. So it gave me a little bit of perspective. A bias that you've probably heard of before. It's called confirmation bias. And it is exactly what you think it is. You get an idea in your head of how the world works, and no matter what, you can't be convinced otherwise. If you see any evidence that conflicts with it, you just say fake news and move on. One of the most powerful examples of this came during the Iraq War. So the whole idea was Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. We have to go in there and stop him. I was convinced by this. It was such a compelling argument. As it turns out, not so much with the weapons of mass destruction. And even when the president of the United States, right, within a year was already saying, hey, you know what, there's not so much with the weapons of mass destruction. Fast forward to 2015, and over 50% of Republicans still believe that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and 35% of Democrats. And if you watch Fox News, you were far more likely to believe that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, even 12 years later. And that was a source for confirming information. So this is an extremely powerful bias, and we will be coming back to it later. Now, the problem with these biases are they are extremely difficult to combat, right? The first problem is you may not know you have them. There's a bias that is actually called the bias blind spot. It's basically a situation where you don't think you're biased, but you're sure everybody else is. Part of the problem is 95% of cognition happens below the conscious level. Now, as Phil said, I've got a book on this coming out in a couple months. And originally, I thought it was 90%. And when I did the research, I realized, oh my God, it's actually 95%. So these are conservative estimates here. So the next time somebody asks you why you did something, the most honest answer you can give is, how the hell should I know? Even if you do know, even if you land in that 5%, right, you'll probably still commit the bias anyway. So there's a bias called anchoring. And the way it works is I could ask everybody on this call to write down the last 2 numbers of your social security number. And then I could say, okay, we're all going to go bid on this bottle of wine. Those of you who wrote down a higher number will bid higher. Those of you who wrote down a lower number will bid lower. It's anchoring, it's a thing. Now, if I were to tell you that before we did the experiment, if I said, hey, there's this thing called anchoring, we're going to bid on a bottle of wine, try not to do it, you'd still do it. It gets worse. If I were to say, hey, there's this thing called anchoring, and I will pay you cash money not to do it, you still do it. Now, the reason we as designers or makers of things need to care about choice architecture or about cognitive bias is because of choice architecture, right? And an example of choice architecture might be when you go buy produce, in the rare instances we do that now. The common wisdom is you never pick from the top. Why? Because the person who owns the produce is trying to move the produce that's going bad. So they're going to put that at the top because they figure people will reach for the thing that's closest. They have architected that situation to benefit themselves. Now, they could just as easily have architected it to benefit you, the user, and put the freshest stuff up top where it's easy to reach. But that architecting of choices is very much our job. So think about the decisions your user needs to make. And now think about how people make decisions, not how we think they make decisions, not how a rational person makes decisions, because that doesn't exist. 95% of the time, they're not really thinking. And as it turns out, there are content and design choices we can make that help keep harmful cognitive biases in check or maybe even leverage them for good. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. So let's go back to that skinny white dude and the name at the top of the resume. As it turns out, in study after study after study, if you have two identical resumes, and the only difference is the name at the top, if it is a male-dominated field and it's a male name at the top of the resume, that gets moved up the chain. If it is a female name or it seems like a female name at the top of the resume, it gets left behind. Here's the thing. Why do you need that information? What about the name is helping you, the hiring manager, figure out who qualifies? So think of it like a content strategy problem, a signal versus noise problem, right? The signal in that resume is the qualifications, the experience. The noise is the gender or the race or whatever you're reading into as gender and race based on the name you see. So the city of Philadelphia, in fact, did a round of blind hiring for a web developer position, and they discovered a couple of things. One is, even in the high-tech world of web development, the best way to blind a resume is to have an intern who has no stake in the hiring process physically print out the resume, get a marker, and just redact it like a CIA document. Another thing they discovered was that even when they found somebody they liked, right, they found these qualifications, one of the very next things they do is look up their GitHub profile. For those of you who don't know, GitHub is a code repository, and it's generally where you could see the portfolio, if you will, of a developer. What would happen the second that they went to the GitHub profile? All of the personal information would be revealed. The experiment would be ruined. So clever people that they are, they created a Chrome plugin that would redact all of that personal information as the GitHub profile loaded. And to complete the circle, they took that code and they put it back on GitHub, and it's there now if you ever want to use it. This doesn't just apply to helping humans make hiring decisions. A few years ago, Amazon had a bot that was supposed to help people make hiring decisions. And I want you to sit down. It's going to come as a big shock. It was sexist. How sexist was it? If it even saw the name of a women's college on the resume, it would hold it back. It would downgrade it. So they tried to figure out, how did this AI get so sexist? Well, they looked at the training data for the AI, because that's how AIs make decisions. They're trained on data and they decide to make predictions based on what they see. So the training data was basically the last 10 years of resumes, which most of them came from guys. So the AI took one look at that, said, oh, you sure must like dudes, and then just kept recommending dudes. Now, this points out a flaw in how we think about training AI. We think that AI is unbiased because it's a robot, but it's simply inheriting and scaling the AI, the biases of what we give it to learn on. So I am a big proponent of flat out lying to AI and saying, oh yeah, you know what? Women are hired much more frequently. So let me give you that impression of the world. Or, oh no, Black families are much more often giving housing loans. Let me give you that impression of the world, because rather than give it the racist or sexist world we have, why not train it on the less racist and less sexist world you want? Now this can go in the other direction. So again, Amazon, they have Amazon Go stores. And the way these stores work is you walk in, take what you want, and you leave. There is no cashier because Amazon is auto-magically deducting everything you take from your account. A very, I would imagine, unexpected side effect of this is folks like Ashley Clark Thompson, who wrote an article about this for CNET, noticed a distinct difference in her shopping experience. So for those of you who have never had this experience, there's a phenomenon known as shopping while black. And what it looks like is hyper-aggressive customer service. Can I help you? No, really, can I help you? No, really, can I help you? It is customer service as microaggression. But here, there was no one to do that, no one to follow her around the store suspiciously. So in removing one element of the service design, specifically the cashiers, they were able to achieve a less biased experience for this customer. We're also seeing this play out in the judicial system. So San Francisco, as with many DA's offices, was encountering a phenomenon where the district attorney, who, by the way, has extreme leeway in who to charge, deciding who to charge or not charge, would typically charge persons of color far more frequently than their white counterparts. And again, the thought was, well, why do we even need that information in the crime report? Why do I need to know the race of the people involved? Why do I even need to know the location, right? I just need to know the details of the crime itself and decide based on that whether or not to charge. So they did, in fact, roll out a blind charging system last summer. I'm actually been, for the past year, trying to figure out if there were any results, and I'm fingers crossed. I actually recently got put in touch with someone from the DA's office, so knock wood, I'll be able to tell you more later. But this is an attempt that they've made. I want to talk for a bit about cognitive fluency because it very directly influences content strategy and design. And it's the concept that something that looks easy to read, whatever it's talking about, I will assume it's also easy to do. By the same token, if what I'm looking at looks like it's going to be hard to read, I will assume whatever it's talking about is also hard to do. So I love pancakes. I had pancakes this morning, and if I'm perfectly candid, most mornings during this situation, I love making them. I would make them all for you if I could. This is a recipe for pancakes. And the text is kind of small and clumped together. And if I glance at this, I think, I bet pancakes are hard to make. I don't think I'm going to make pancakes. But if I look at something that is nice, big photography and small chunks of text, I might think, I bet pancakes aren't that hard. I might make pancakes. 2-minute video? Forget it. We're making pancakes. Now, think about how this applies to things like public transportation. So this is 2 different ways to find out how to get from Media Elwyn in Pennsylvania to downtown Philadelphia. And if I look at that schedule on the left, I think to myself, there is no way public transportation is going to get me there. This looks more, getting there is going to be incredibly difficult. If on the other hand, I look to the right and see an app that's just basic, asking for some basic information. Again, I haven't read anything yet, but just by glancing at it, I'm thinking, oh, I bet it's pretty easy to get downtown using public transportation. Another way this plays out is in how we think about the truth. So show of hands, well, we can't really do show of hands. I mean, I guess we could, but if we were to ask, right, typically in an audience, how many people here think that Rosa Parks was born in 1912? You'd see a show of hands, and then I would ask, how many people here think that Rosa Parks was born in 1914, right? Now, as it turns out, no matter which you picked, you're wrong. She was born in 1913, but more often than not, people pick 1914. The reason being that the easier something is to read, the more true we actually think it is. But it gets worse. If it rhymes, we actually think it's more true. And this has consequences. So what's going on here is that we like certainty and we hate uncertainty. That's one thing I've learned by looking at bias after bias after bias. All of them are designed to help get us to certainty, even if it means throwing logic under the bus. So things that rhyme are easy to process. Things that are easy to read are easy to process. And we equate easy to process with more certain, more true. If I were to ask you, what did you get for your 5th birthday? Did you get a truck? You might be like, I don't know about that. I can't really remember. I can't really process that too well. And so you wouldn't be very certain it was true. If on the other hand, I asked you what you had for breakfast, you'd be pretty certain in your answer because it's easy to remember, it's easy to process. Things that rhyme are easy to remember. Things that are easy to read are easy to process. And so we make that equation very easily. Now, there are lots of ways in which that's dangerous, but there are other ways in which it might actually be very helpful. So as it happens in this country, African Americans are very suspicious of health information that comes from the government. If you look at 2003 national survey, if you look at the statement, the government usually tells the truth about major health issues like HIV/AIDS, only 37% of African Americans agreed with that statement. That number had dropped to 18% by 2016. Now, we could do a whole other talk, and there have been many books written about why African Americans have very, very legit concerns about health information coming from the government, but this is information that could save lives. So if rhyming needs to be brought into play, if plain language and easy and clear design need to come into play, they should. And of course, everything I'm talking about here with health information is 10 times more important right now. As it turns out, and benefits of having to write a book about this stuff, I have an editor who challenges me and says, yeah, but can you actually point to instances where better design has led to better health outcomes? And I'm glad she challenged me, because now I can actually tell you, yep, this has actually worked out. So this is a study where they were trying to help people not smoke while pregnant or just after they'd had their children. And pregnant smokers and ex-smokers who received a specially designed intervention with materials written at the 3rd grade reading level were more likely to achieve abstinence, this is abstinence from smoking, during pregnancy and 6 weeks postpartum than those who received standard materials, right? So the reading level, the plain language aspect makes sense. It actually helps. Similarly, a plain language, pictogram-based, right, easy to process intervention used as part of medication counseling resulted in decreased medication dosing errors, which are a very big problem, and improved adherence, which is a huge problem in taking medicine among multi-ethnic, low socioeconomic status caregivers whose children were treated at an urban pediatric emergency department. So this stuff saves lives. Now you may be saying, that's all good and well, but rhyming, really? My editor said the same thing, and I'm glad she did, because it forced me to actually do the work and find out that, yep, click it or ticket. So a while back, there was a campaign called Click It or Ticket to basically make people wear their seatbelts. Part of it was legal, like you could actually get a ticket for wearing your seatbelt, and that did some impact, but it wasn't having that much penetration with younger people. So they added this sort of media campaign called Click It or Ticket. National belt use among young men and women ages 16 to 24 moved from 65% to 72% and 73% to 80% respectively. And before you ask, there are in fact hard numbers associated with what those percentage points mean. It's estimated that for each percentage point increase in seatbelt use, an additional 2.8 million people are buckled up and about 270 lives are saved. So rough math, that's about 4,000 lives saved by rhyming. And there are in fact federal plain language guidelines. There was a Plain Language Act of 2010 which basically says, hey, if you are creating content for a website receiving federal funds to provide services, you'd better be talking about those services in plain language. And I highly recommend looking at 18F. They're an organization that has produced some amazing plain language guidelines that are good even if you're not working in government. Another quirk of this cognitive fluency thing is how we perceive distance and price. So normally if I'm putting something on sale and I want to display that, I will put the original price slashed out next to the new sale price. Interesting study is that if you make them further apart horizontally, it'll actually look like a better deal, even if it's the exact same deal. And just to make this weirder, it only works vertically. It doesn't work. Works horizontally, not vertically. We are so weird. Another place that fluency and easy to process comes into play is name pronunciation. There is in fact a name pronunciation effect where names that are easier to pronounce basically have it better, right? It affects voting preferences and occupational status. My favorite example of this is they looked at a law firm, and they would notice in law firms, the higher up you went, the easier the names got to pronounce. Caveat, name pronunciation is culturally sensitive. So if your name is easier to pronounce in the dominant culture, you will do better. And this even extends to stocks, right? So if you have an IPO, if the name of the stock is easier to pronounce, right, it tends to do better. If even the little ticker abbreviation is easier to pronounce, it will do better. So we will lay down cash money on stuff that's easy to process. We also see this play out in a phenomenon known as primacy. So we tend to remember the things at the beginning of a list more so than anything in the middle. And we tend to just put more weight in general to things that are at the top than at the bottom. And the way this played out for Amazon when they first introduced reviews was that people would assume the first review was the most authoritative, when in fact it was just the most recent. So they created this thing called helpfulness, right? Was this review helpful? And they would put the most helpful review at the top, which it's a little better, but if it was a positive review, people would assume, yeah, this must be a good product. And if it was a negative review, the opposite. So they got into the habit of putting the most positive, helpful review right next to the most helpful negative review. giving them equal visual weight, which made you, the user, give them equal intellectual weight. Another one we encounter very frequently is the bandwagon effect. And this is exactly what you think it is. If a whole bunch of people are doing something, it seems like a good idea for you to do it too. This plays out in a fun little experiment where you say, okay, here's exhibit 1, and looking at A, B, or C, you tell me which of those lines is most similar to exhibit 1. And if it was just you and me, you'd say, oh, A, obviously. But that's not how we do it. I put you in a room with 12 other people, and you go last. And before you go, the 12 other people say B. So by the time I get to you, you say B? And they'll talk to people and they'll tell them, I wasn't sure if maybe I misunderstood the question. I wasn't sure if everyone else knew something I didn't. The interesting thing about the bandwagon effect is it's surprisingly easy to counteract. If there is even one other person in the room who says A, you are much more likely to say A when we get to you. And so when we are doing things like design exercises, where we need people to give honest opinions, it is much better to have some kind of blind voting where I can't be influenced by everyone else's vote than it is to just have everyone raise their hands. Because if the most important person in the room raises their hand and says B, you can bet everybody else who depends on that person for their income is also going to say, yeah, B. In my opinion, the most dangerous bias in the world is called the framing effect. And it starts out innocent enough. Let's say you go to a store and you see a sign that says beef, 95% lean. And next to that, there's another sign that says beef, 5% fat. Which one do you think people are going to flock to? Now, it is obviously the same thing, but I've framed that decision in a way that makes you prefer one over the other. Now, this is innocent enough when we're talking about beef, but what if I were to say, should we go to war in April or should we go to war in May? You see what I did there? We're no longer discussing whether or not we should go to war in the first place. And wars have been started over less. Now, those of you who are multilingual or even bilingual have an advantage. If you think about the decision in your non-native language, you are far less likely to fall for the scam. I speak a little bit of French. And so if I think about the beef decision in French, it goes, let's see, beef, that's a boeuf, that's a lot of vowels, 95%, 89, maybe, right? And by the time I've thought through all that, the scam is obvious, right? Because I've slowed down my thinking. The seminal work on cognitive bias is called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Read that, you won't need to see another lecture in your life. But the primary kind of theme there is that when we are thinking quickly, we are far more likely to fall for one of these traps. When we can actually take the time to think carefully about something, we can see it for what it is. Now, this is one of those biases that could be used for good. So there's an experiment where I have an audience and I ask them, should this person drive this car? And what I'll get is a policy discussion. Some people will say, oh, old people are terrible at everything, don't let them drive. And other people will say, that's ageist, how dare you? All I will learn by the end of that conversation is who's on what side. Now I can show the same photo, change 2 words, and ask, how might this person drive this car? And what I'll get is a design discussion. And some people will say, oh, what if we change the shape of the steering wheel? And other people will say, oh, what if we move the dashboard? And what I'll learn by the end of that conversation is several ways that person might be able to drive that car. The frame I have placed, even by just changing 2 words, has utterly changed the conversation we've decided to have. In fact, I could say, how might we do a better job of moving people around? Because that's why the person was in the car in the first place, because he was here and he wanted to be there. And if I frame it this way, public transportation's on the table. And we've seen this play out in student-teacher evaluations. This is yet another field where women and people of color are at a disadvantage. Typically, their courses will be rated lower than their white counterparts. So University of Iowa said, let's try this. And they put 2 paragraphs, very short paragraphs, at the beginning of the survey they sent to students that basically said just that. Hey, just so you know, this is an area where women and people of color are usually given lower ratings. So when you make your rating, make sure you're rating on substantive things and not appearance or whatever. The people who got that intervention scored their teachers higher, their male, their female, and people of color teachers higher than the people who didn't get that paragraph. Again, the survey was framed in a way to make them aware of that bias. I'd like to close by talking about our own cognitive biases because these are the ones that are the most dangerous. I'd like to first talk about notational bias. And an example of notational bias is how I was brought up around music. I used to play saxophone and I had to learn to read Western traditional, sheet music like this, Western notation. And in my head, I was like, well, all music in the world can be expressed like this, right? This is the common denominator. And I came to learn later that nope, there's all sorts of Asian music, all sorts of African music this is a completely inadequate way to try to express that. And you wipe out entire cultures if you make this the default. Now, a more familiar pattern we're probably used to seeing is when we're asking people for personal information, right? If I have it in my head that there are only two genders, male and female, right? I'm going to now express that and impose it upon the world and eliminate God knows how many identities. By the way, while we're on the topic of asking for personal information, there's a thing called the self-serving bias. And the way it works is if something goes well, it's my fault. If something goes poorly, it's your fault. And this plays out with computers as well. All things being equal, if I'm trying to do something on a computer and something goes wrong, I'll blame the computer. And if something goes right, I'll blame me. Unless I have given that computer personal information. The more personal information I give a computer, the more I blame myself when something goes wrong, and the more I blame the computer if something goes right. Now, if you think about this, this makes perfect sense, right? We tend to have the same kind of relationship with our close friends. Who else but our close friends has lots of personal information about us? So let us be very thoughtful and careful about when we decide to ask for personal information. Because on top of all the other concerns around it, there is also the potential that we're engendering an unhealthy relationship, let's say, between humans and computers. We can also see this scale when it comes to structured content. So until 1986, the New York Times prohibited the use of Ms. as an honorific for women. Every time I read this, I still like, So think about that. The way that works is at the first mention of a name in an article in the New York Times, you would say Mr., you would say first name, last name. At every subsequent mention, it would be Miss last name or Mrs. last name, right? And think about what that engenders, right? Name after name after name, article after article after article. It is telling people the most important thing to know about a woman is whether or not she is married, and then maybe her last name, right? And by the way, Mr. whatever, which was the honorific for men, didn't tell you anything about marriage status. We need to be careful about this because the way we structure content, the way we structure language, the editorial guidelines we create scale our values and kind of impose them on other people. Even subconsciously, remember, what were we just talking about at the beginning? Patterns. This is a pattern. So we need to be very thoughtful about the way we structure content. As Mbimu Gogomu once said, language doesn't just describe reality, it shapes it. And this is legally true. If you think back to when Bush was in office, Dick Cheney comes into power and says, what are my options here? He talks to his lawyers, and his lawyers say, well, look, you are the vice president, so obviously you are in the executive branch. However, you cast the tie-breaking vote in the Senate, so technically you are in the legislative branch, but you can't be in the executive branch and the legislative branch. So maybe you're in neither. And if you're in neither, you don't have to follow the rules of either. And he didn't. Now we see the same thing play out today with different platforms, right? So Facebook, for example, when it suits them, says, hey, we're a publisher. New York Times, come publish with us. We understand you, come publish with us. But when someone points out, oh, there are rules for publishers, Facebook says, I don't know what you heard, we're a platform. Yeah, read the fine print. Now, there are tools out there to help us think about language in a more inclusive, open way. Radical copy editors are a great source for thinking about how to write for and about people who generally don't get a lot of say in how they're written about. Additionally, there is Textio, which does a really good job, among other things, of helping you think about how to craft resumes that are more inclusive, because not everybody wants to be a rock star or a ninja. By the way, I will be sending out after this a resource sheet, so all of these resources I'm mentioning will be in there. Now, one of my favorite quirks of language that we don't really have access to in English is called evidentiality. And evidentiality is something that other languages have, and it plays out in their verb tense. English uses verb tense pretty flat, right? All you can really get out of verb tense in English is when something happens, right? Bob will go to the store, Bob is going to the store, Bob went to the store. Other languages like Turkish make their verb tense do a little more heavy lifting, and they let you know, how do I know that Bob went to the store, right? So there's one verb tense for I saw Bob go to the store. There's another verb tense for somebody told me that Bob went to the store, and maybe a whole other verb tense for I read on the internet that Bob went to the store. The point is, I can't tell you that Bob went to the store without also telling you how I know Bob went to the store. And I think you can imagine how that might be helpful nowadays. So while English doesn't inherently have mandatory evidentiality, I think we can play with design to give it a nudge. So we talked earlier about how stuff that's easy to read is easier to believe. It works in the reverse as well. If something's harder to read, it's harder to believe. So this is an actual article that came out a while back about the new James Bond movie. And the first paragraph is just basically verifiable information, right? This is what the movie's called, the trailer came out, blah, blah, blah. The second paragraph is literally about a rumor about why the first director got kicked off the film. And it is harder to read and is therefore harder to believe. But it should be because it's a rumor. So I'm going to encourage folks to start to play with design to help bring evidentiality into the English language. Told you we'd come back to this one. So I want to tell you how I got the scientific method completely wrong. I used to think it went like this. I have an idea about how the world works, and I test that idea. And if I'm right, great. You try the same thing I did, and you try the same thing I did. And if we all agree, great. Write that law down, move on to the next hypothesis. After talking to some real scientists, I found out it's not quite that simple. It's more like this. I have an idea about how the world works, and I try that out. And if I'm right, you try what I tried, and you try what I tried. And if we all agree, great. I get to spend the rest of forever trying to prove myself wrong. I have to ask myself, if I'm wrong, what else might be true? Okay, let me try and prove that. That's much more like the real scientific method. It is much more rigorous, and it was designed specifically to fight confirmation bias. Now, we as designers can very easily leave good design on the table, right? Because we find an idea that we like. And let me show you just how easy it is to do that. So we're going to play a game with the computer, and the computer is going to say, okay, put whatever number you want where that question mark is. And the computer will tell you if that number fits the pattern. Put in as many numbers as you like. And when you think you know what the pattern is, tell the computer what you think the pattern is. If you're like me, you start by trying 8. And the computer says, congratulations, that fits the pattern. Would you like to try another number? And if you're like me, you say, hold my beer. I've got this. The pattern is even numbers. And the computer says, you're wrong. And it says I'm wrong because I didn't try this. The pattern is not even numbers. The pattern is every number is higher than the number that came before it, which is a much more elegant solution and much easier to program. But I never got there because I was so in love with my even numbers idea. Now, there are all sorts of tools out there to help us get beyond, right, the ideas we fall in love with. One of them is called red versus blue, and it's a method that journalists use, and it's a method that the military uses. And how many things can you say that about? But the idea is you have a blue team, and the blue team does the research and does the UX work and kind of gets the thing to a shape where you're almost ready to prototype. But before they go that far, you have the red team come in for one day, and their job is to go to war with the blue team and to point out all the deficits, to point out all the things that actually might cause harm, to find all the more elegant things that the blue team missed because they were so in love with the idea they came up with. And what I like about this idea is it's fairly cost effective. I don't have to go to my COO and say, hey, guess what? We have to spin up 2 teams now for every design project, and they have to check each other's work all the time. No, I need one team for one day to make sure we're not putting something harmful out into the world. Another fun tool for this approach is called speculative design, and it's telling stories about how badly things can go. If you've ever watched Black Mirror, you know exactly what this is like. Black Mirror is kind of like the Twilight Zone for tech. You have some near future technology, and you tell a story about how real humans would use this, and it's uniformly terrible, right? In fact, I think there should be a law that anybody working on a new technology should, by law, have to write a Black Mirror episode about it. One of my favorite examples of this is there was a group named Superflux, and they were hired by the United Arab Emirates to come help them think about the future of energy, right? They were having this conference. What's the future of energy? Should we go with renewables? Should we stay with what we're doing? And among many other things, one of the projects the Superflux did was to say, okay, let me tell you what the air quality is going to be like if you continue down the road of fossil fuels in, different years, 10 years out, 15 years out, and so on. But they didn't just tell them what it would be like. They bottled it, right? They actually figured out what chemicals would be in there, and they bottled it, and they made them inhale it. And by the time he got 10 years out, it was unbreathable, right? Causation or correlation, but by the end of that conference, they had announced that they were going to put something like 150 billion with a B into renewables. The last bias I'm going to talk about is called déformation professionnelle. Told you I speak French. The basic idea behind it is that we view the world through the lens of our job. And in our workaholic society, that might seem like a good thing until it's not. The paparazzi who ran Princess Di off the road that night probably thought they were doing an amazing job. And technically speaking, they were. Technically speaking, they were getting very difficult to get shots that were going to fetch them a very high sum. But what they were not doing a good job of was being human beings. Now, when the former police commissioner of Philadelphia took the job, he asked his officers, what do you think your job is? And pretty much to a person, they said, to enforce the law. And he said, that's a reasonable enough answer, but what if I were to tell you your job is to protect civil rights? Now, that's a bigger job. It encompasses enforcing the law, but it forces you to treat people with dignity. It gives you permission to treat people with dignity. But it's a harder job than they thought. And I would submit that our jobs are harder than we think. Our job is not to design cool stuff, right? And we have to ask ourselves, how might we describe our jobs and define them in a way that allows us to be more human to each other? Now, some folks are already working on this. Mike Montero at Mule Design has produced a design ethics booklet that proposes a kind of Hippocratic oath for designers. First, do no harm, right? We've seen the Marcula Center for Applied Ethics has produced some great work around breaking down a problem into the different ethical ways you can think about it. Which option will produce the most good and do the least harm? Which option treats people equally or proportionately? People have been thinking about these problems for a very long time. It's about time we actually took advantage of that. One of my favorite interactions around this is called the Tarot Cards of Tech. And it's just this interaction where you have all these little cards that ask you very provocative questions about your product. So this one, how might cultural habits change how your product is used? And how might your product change cultural habits? If Twitter had asked this question before it launched, I think we'd have a very different world today. Another nice interaction around this is called 52 UX cards to discover cognitive biases. And the nice thing about this one is, in addition to the cards, you're given a list of instructions for exercises around using these cards to reveal bias. A great visual approach to this is called Humane by Design. And it's this wonderful layout for thinking about different ethical approaches in the design of your product. It's also just a gorgeous website. You should check it out. And we see this play out in software as well. So the Never Again pledge was something that a lot of web designers and web developers started signing on to once they started being asked to do very sketchy things with data, which, as it turns out, has a very long history in tech of people being asked to do sketchy things with data. But they basically said, look, here are a list of things that we will not do. And you start to see this play out in real life situations. So Project Maven was a battlefield AI that Google was working on, and a whole bunch of designers, software developers at Google said, we did not get into this business to create weapons. We're not going to do it. And they held out for long enough that Google essentially walked away from a $250 million contract. Now, the very next day, they turned around and started working on Dragonfly, which is censored search in China, and this is still playing out. But the idea is people are starting to discover the power of collective action. By the way, Maven, Dragonfly, I'm just astounded by like who comes up with like these James Bond names for project. It's some human adult actually put that in an email. We must rapidly begin to shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. Now, this was not some software guru at a TED Talk. This was Martin Luther King Jr. 50 years ago, he saw this, and it's only more true today. So I ask everybody on this call, how might we define our jobs in a way that allows us to be more human to each other? Thank you.
Wow, Dave, good job. Thank you so much. Every time you go through this this talk, I think I've seen it now 3 times. This is the 3rd time I've seen it. I just like things from my past and things that I probably could have done better come to mind. I've been writing a blog post for probably about 5 or 6 years about an event that I had with an interaction I had with a client where they told me to my face because they didn't like the color palette that we were dealing with, that we were trying to build an accessible color palette, and they were like, I just don't care about colorblind people. Not that they don't care about colorblind people. They don't care about the fact that colorblind people would have a challenge, you know, being able to see the data that we're trying to represent in the interface. And lo and behold, the person sitting right next to him was colorblind, and pointed it out to him. And it, you know, it was just an interesting thing. And that brought me to think about, we have a couple of questions in the Q&A channel that I'm going to get to, but you know, it made me think about like, how can we use these ways that our minds kind of work, you know, in the same sense that you're talking about as designers and as content strategists. How can we use these to make more compelling cases to the people that we have to make cases to? Like, I felt like I bumbled that conversation with that client because I was just like, what, you don't care about people? Like, you know, I was just so taken aback by it. And I always think back to how you can facilitate a better conversation like that without just blatantly accusing someone of not caring about people. So.
Yeah, and at the risk of blatantly plugging my book, there's literally the entire middle section of the book is about just that problem of not just, hey, here are some biases we need to work around. It's like, hey, you're gonna have to convince somebody about this stuff. So let me tell you about their biases, right? And how you can kind of manipulate those to kind of get more buy-in. Yeah.
Yep. And exactly. The one thing you bring up all the time, which I love because it always reminds me of the great show, The West Wing. Is the whole red versus blue part of the story, which is you know, in the West Wing, you learned, and this is actually a common practice for politicians everywhere, is they have members of their team actually write opposition positions for their policy positions, and that's done consciously because you essentially want to be able to, you know, come up against your opposition before they bring it up. You know, I mean, that's the whole point of, you know, if you're practicing for a debate, having someone else play that role. And it reminds me of an old brainstorming technique that we used to do in an organization that I worked at, which was we would actually, you know, put together the design brief and the challenge, and then invite the team to design the worst solution. So each team would be broken up into teams of 2.
Yeah.
Teams of 2 would have to design the worst solution for the problem that was presented. And it still had to be in the bounds of what the problem was. You couldn't just say like, yeah, we're going to design a shoe, and, you know, the shoe doesn't solve the problem. And then the interesting part of that was that, like, you were getting all kinds of awful things put in there, but then the next step of that brainstorming process was to talk about what made that a terrible solution, and figure out how to make it a good solution. So how to take the terrible part out of it. So it was always a very interesting challenge. I don't have any question for you on that. I just thought it was.
No, but it does remind me of another, because what we're talking about is framing effect, right? Different ways to frame a design problem to get a different solution. One of my favorites is I was working with a very, very big, wealthy corporation, and we're working on a new product. And we had an exercise where it's like, okay, I want you to pretend that you're a startup who's going to beat you. How did you get beat? And they'd had to develop a product with like no funding that would beat them.
Yeah.
And it was a really, you know, yeah, I liked that.
I'll be honest with you, this is an exercise that we go through every year when we get together as an organization for our annual planning. You know, the leadership team at Think Company, and a question that we put out there is, hey, 365 days from now, we've gone bankrupt. Talk about why.
Yeah. That's called a pre-mortem. Yeah, I
Yeah,
love that.
exactly. And we look at all those things, and all of a sudden, all of the anxieties that everyone on the team has that they don't want to bring up because they're like, well, I'm worried about this, but I don't want to bring it up because I'm afraid of authority or whatever. All of a sudden, those things come to the surface, and they're like, oh yeah, well, we went bankrupt because we didn't predict a global pandemic,
Well,
or
no, and
something
this,
like
I
that.
mean,
So
and this is important, and we'll get to the question. I just want to make sure to bring this one point is that what's nice about that exercise is it forces you to do something that humans are very bad at, which is thinking about bad outcomes. We don't like to think about bad outcomes. The whole reason, if you've ever seen The Big Short, the whole reason a few people were able to make money when that happened is because they were willing to think about the unthinkable.
right, exactly. Yeah,
So it's a superpower to be able to do that.
that's great. Yeah. All right, so we have a couple questions. I was stalling a little bit because there were two anonymous questions, but we actually have a question asked by someone who decided not to be anonymous. So I'm going to let her go first. Sharon, I've unmuted you. Let's see if that works. Can you hear us? We've also taken her by surprise because she just posted the question, so um, she may not want to ask the question herself. We'll give her a couple more seconds. Sharon, you're live. You're live with Dave. Okay. Well, something's going on with that, so I'll ask her a question. She just asked, it's Sharon Pastori. She asked, how would you differentiate cognitive bias versus intuitive decision making, or
Mm.
the idea of trusting your gut? And what a great question. This is something that comes up all the time in the world where, you're sitting there with a client's like, I know what I'm talking about. I know this industry, like, just trust my gut. So how do we differentiate between that and when cognitive bias is being introduced?
The snarky answer is look at the outcome, right? Because I think it's coming from the exact same place. So a while back, Malcolm Gladwell wrote this book called Blink. And one of the opening things he talks about is a guy whose job is to detect art forgeries. And this one instance, he looks at this painting and just there's a gut reaction the guy has to it that just says, this is wrong. And he can't point to it. And it takes a while because it was a really good forgery. It takes a while to finally figure out what was actually wrong with it. But he had a gut. And what's happening there, best guess is a different version of pattern recognition. And what you have to ask yourself is the pattern valid, right? Because when I talk about that example of someone looking at a resume and seeing a female name at the top and then they're having a gut reaction to it that's just unpleasant, that's intuition. It's intuition that's based on a false premise, but it's still intuition. Versus the art forgery guy, he had an intuition based on patterns he's seen, but it was based on a valid pattern, a just pattern. So we very quickly, it's a great question because it kind of gets you to the heart of why we talk about bias. Because when we really talk about bias, we're talking about shortcuts. We're talking about patterns. And what that pattern is based on is the difference between intuition and unjust bias. If that pattern is based on years of slavery and sexism, yeah, you're going to have a gut, but it's going to be a gut that leads you to do more of the same. If, on the other hand, it's a pattern based on hey, I've seen this help people time and time again. I have a gut that we should probably follow this path. Okay, that's now intuition. So it's a bit of a cop-out answer, but I guess what I'm really saying is that there's not really a difference. What's different is what is that intuition based? What pattern is unconscious pattern is that intuition based on?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that's great guidance. Like the advice that I would give someone in that situation, which takes a long time to learn, especially in the design industry that we're in, is that it's really about asking the right questions. Like, even if someone presents their gut to you and says, just do it this way, I have a gut around that. Like, there's no problem with continuing to investigate what is the root of that gut feeling that they have. Because if they start to get the sense that their gut feeling is something nefarious in the background, they will eventually drop it. They may, like, I I I, I was a teenager working in a gift shop once, and occasionally the owner of the shop would instruct me to follow someone around the shop if he was worried that they were going to steal something. And lo and behold, most of the people he was asking me to follow around were people of color. And finally, I started asking him questions like that. I was just like, ornery 16-year-old kid, and got him to actually admit that.
Mm.
That's why he was pointing. It wasn't every person of color, but it was a person of color, and they, to him, there was something about them that, and we had 5 instances that I had been working there where people visibly stole something and ran out of the shop, and every single time it was a white person.
Yeah.
So I was like, so you're asking me to act on something that like we don't have any evidence to prove. And from that point on, he just sort of dropped it. He wasn't asking me to like follow people around the shop anymore. And I felt better about myself, but it was like it's things like that where if you can sort of innocently investigate what that gut reaction is that they have, eventually they're gonna kind of recognize that maybe their gut is based on something that's not based in reality or truth.
Yeah, and that's why you want people there to check your intuitions. That's why you want to say, my gut tells me this, but if I'm wrong, what else would be true? And find someone to help you prove that,
Right.
It's about having multiple perspectives as well.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Thank you for the question, Sharon. I'm sorry we couldn't get your microphone working, or maybe you just didn't want to talk. That's fine too. Okay, the next. Oh, she couldn't get in time. She just apologized for that. Okay, sorry about that, Sharon. We'll go to a couple anonymous questions. Let me bring the screen down here so I look like I'm talking to you, Dave. Okay, so the next one is, in a world where people are still on the fence about whether or not people's prejudice informs their bias or actions, despite the data, how do you advocate for making better design decisions around cognitive bias? That's a loaded question. I don't know if you need me to read that a couple of times, but
Yeah, it's kind of back to that same notion of like, how do I convince my boss this is a good idea, especially if maybe they are. In fact, I mean, you like the situation you had, like my boss might be prejudiced. How do I convince them to not do that? I think that, so there's a lot, like I said, there's a whole chapter in the book about this, but I think a lot of the time when it comes back to, especially if you're talking about like racial or gender bias, where people have an immediate defensive reaction if you even bring up the topic without even using their name. And this is just a general like management consulting 101, but rather than try to convince them of something you believe, try to convince them of something they believe. So I'm going to give you two quick examples. One is Don't Mess with Texas, which started out as an anti-littering campaign. Texas highways were filthy, and it was very hard to convince good old boys to pick up after themselves. But as soon as they tied it to the identity of Texas and framed, going back to framing effect, framed littering as messing with Texas, now it was the good old boys idea to pick things up. And it like literally 70% reduction in litter. Like that's how powerful this was. But rather than making it about some value or ideal that was foreign to them, they made it about a value or ideal that they had since birth. Like, this is Texas. You don't mess with it. Of course I'm going to go and pick this up. One of my favorite, actually, like disarming comments, a friend of mine was just telling me about this, is at the beginning of a sensitive email, you start with the phrase, I know we're on the same page about this, right?
Right.
So now both of you are covered and no one has to feel defensive. It's like, yeah, of course. Yeah, Texas is awesome. Littering is terrible. Of course. We all agree. So there's that piece. And then the other piece I would say is very important is to, this is a little Machiavellian, but frame it such that it isn't your idea at all. It's their idea, right? So again, to give you a quick example, I had a client who really loved this content they had behind a paywall. They loved the idea of the paywall. And our research indicated that that paywall wasn't, the users didn't care enough, even remotely, to pay for the content. And if we brought this up directly, it just status quo bias, like they couldn't see it. So instead we did an exercise brainstorming solutions for how to align user goals, which we'd researched, and business goals that we had done exercises around. How might we use content to align these goals? Open air, brainstorming session. One of the ideas that came out of the brainstorming session was, what if we pulled this content from behind the paywall? To which we said, that is a great idea that I'm glad that you came up with, right?
And that, there's so much around this. I'm going to avoid getting too political here because we could talk about framing forever, but we have seen a huge wave of people who, a year ago was telling us that protesting anything was un-American, and all of a sudden protesting things today is like wildly American. So I think that's one good example of how things can be continue to be reframed. But I think the example that you gave is a great example to go to the next question, which is, if we start using these cognitive biases for good, I'm going to put that in air quotes, And if we start using them to our advantage, then how do we get into ethically dangerous territory? So the example that you gave of, which is something that I guide designers to do all the time. Uh, help clients get to your point by helping them come to the same conclusion as you. Make it their decision. Make it their idea. Take them through that thought process and put the effort into that. There's like a fine line between doing that and being wildly manipulative. Which actually you may be practicing your own confirmation bias. So like, how do we get ourselves, the next question by another anonymous post was, how do we get out of that ethically dangerous territory, or are we even in that ethically dangerous territory? And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
This is going to sound weird, but if you are doing your job, you are never not in ethically dangerous territory. And what I mean by that is you should always be questioning your assumptions. And it's when you stop questioning your assumptions that you are facilitating entering ethically dangerous territory. Like ethics, it's important to understand that ethics is not a list of things to do. Ethics is a system for thinking about what is right and wrong, as opposed to a list of rules of what is right and wrong. And that's why I said, like, people have been thinking about this for thousands of years, in part because it's really important, but also in part because you can't solve it. You can't write down the definitive answer, right? That's the whole point.
Yeah.
So I think that an ethical framework, like those resources I put out there, are kind of meant to provoke. They're meant to challenge your approaches. So if we're looking at it in terms of, should I use this method to trick my client into agreeing with me, right? I have to ask myself some of those questions to identify, well, what am I really doing? Because it's just as likely in that scenario where I asked them, how might we use content to align these two sets of goals, that they didn't say, put it behind, they might've said, put more content behind a paywall, right? But I was willing to bank that in a way, I was challenging my own assumption. Like, I was assuming that my solution is correct enough that anyone with the same information would come to the same conclusion, right? And I have decided that is an ethical, approach. But yeah, I would say if you want to keep yourself honest, surround yourself with people not like you. So that, if I was really being rigorous about it, I would say, okay, this is the approach I want to take. You, person who does not have my background, right? And has a completely different experience and maybe has been on the receiving end of manipulation before, what's your take, right? I think that's the ways that we can challenge ourselves with some of these just historically grounded ethical frameworks, so the question part, but then also other people who are not like us. I think if we have a healthy mix of those, even though we're always, I think, in ethically dangerous territory, we have a way to navigate that. That is like the most likely outcome of being fair and just.
Yeah, I mean, you touch on something that I talk about often, which is that I think the most highly functioning teams are the teams that disagree well.
Yeah, exactly.
Like they actually disagree, but they disagree well, and that goes back to, like, creating a I forget what Lincoln called it when he put
a team of rivals.
A team of rivals. Yeah, like that if you just surround yourself by people who are going to agree with you, then you're not going to make the progress that you probably need to make. I mean, that's the end of the questions in the Q&A. I mean, I had a couple of. I'm trying to look at some of the notes that I took. Excuse me for putting my gaze up in a different direction. I mean, the one question that I prepared when you were going through that comes to mind all the time for me is around your anchoring story, and I feel like it's a really good story, and I feel like it takes hope away from me. Like, it makes me like, if I want to be a better person and I can't even in the face of being told you're going to be biased, you are going to be biased, Phil, because here's the bias that you're going to apply, and I can't even get myself over that. Like, what hope is there in the world? So that's kind of a broad question, but like, how do we make ourselves more skeptical towards ourselves, I think.
And I think that there's a couple things, right? So first off, accept, it's a very Serenity Prayer thing, but accept the things you can't change. Prepare for the things you can't change, right? So like, we need oxygen, but you want to go to space. Guess what? We're going to need to prepare for that. Just understand, even though it'd be great to just go out there, not need oxygen, you're going to need oxygen. Same thing. You've got this bias.
Yep.
Lots of people have this bias. So prepare for it. Make sure if you're the person in charge of interviewing people, you are putting in guardrails like not seeing the things that are going to bias you, or better yet, having other people in the bias in the hiring process who are not like you, right? Like I think that like there's a certain degree. I'll talk about the long game and the short game. The long game is in fact exposing yourself to other patterns, so that you can start to over time whittle away at, right, the pattern you've established. And this is kind of what, if you look at the most extreme case of this, right, which is people who are being rehabilitated after having been in hate groups, like it's treated very much like an addiction, and you have the same kind of treatment that you have for addiction. And B, it's a lot of exposure to other patterns. And like, there's a lot of, hey, I'm going to have you go hang out and go to a barbecue with this group that you say you hate, right? Over and over again, right?
Yeah.
But that's a very long game. It takes a long time to really change that up. The short game is more around making sure that you are exposed to, when making decisions, people who are not like you, right? And that the final decision is not left to a monolith. The final decision is coming from, Daniel Kahneman puts it like this. He calls it decision-making quality control. That you have people looking at how decisions are being made. And the same way that the QA team isn't the same people as the people doing the development, like the decision QA team is not the same as the people making the decisions. They come in and say, hey, if you're going to make this decision wisely, you need to do this, 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 and this, right? And we checked, and you exposed yourself to this bias here, and you didn't listen to that person there, and you didn't ask this question here, right? They're going through those same protocols. And the reason we have QA in code is because if it doesn't work, we're out of business. By the same token, if we don't have QA for the decision-making processes, you're going to be unjust or unethical. So it's a similar, almost dispassionate approach to something people get very defensive about. Like, I'll tell you right now, I've taken the IAT, which is a test Harvard developed that basically exposes what your associations are. It's called the implicit association test. And they're actually, if you look at the content on the website, they're very good about telling you this is not going to tell you if you're racist or not, or sexist or not. You should not use this when you're hiring people, blah, 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 blah. What it's going to tell you is what are your unconscious, 95% of your cognition reactions to things. And I'll tell you right now, I have a tendency to associate Black people with weapons more than I do white people with weapons. I am not proud of this, but it's also not a thing that I explicitly control. In fact, that's the whole point. It's not within your control. And there are all sorts of other things that I don't even want to talk about that I realized I have these associations, which, by the way, many, many other people do. But I think the other hurdle to get over, because you're not the first person to ask this question, is the shame of it. And it's not that we shouldn't be ashamed in the sense of we never want to act on that in a way that's going to hurt somebody. Like, that's the thing to be ashamed of. But once you realize that that bias is there, you have to realize, oh, I am now at risk for acting in a way without even realizing it that could cause harm. Okay, now what are the things I can do, again, to put in guardrails? While I work on that, what are the guardrails I can put in for this thing that just like needing oxygen, it's going to happen.
Yeah, it's a great response. It's a great answer. I mean, I don't think the world is hopeless, but I do think that, like, just like you said, just being more aware of those things and building a level of self-awareness and checking yourself, like as editors, we both played the role of editor in a lot of different situations. Like, people are often offended when you say, hey, nothing gets published without a review from someone else. And often there are people who come along and they're like, I know grammar, I know spelling, I use spell check, I don't need you to read it, blah, blah, all that kind of stuff. And I always tell this story of someone that I know that was using a word processing application. Someone had put a very foul word into the spell check dictionary, and they did it in a way where inadvertently it changed in an entire document, like all of these words over into a very foul word. This is in the 80s and 90s before we had more controls around that kind of stuff. And it was in a proposal. It almost for an organization, and it almost went out to a client. And someone who was this is back when you mailed proposals to clients. Someone right before they stuck in the FedEx package was like going through the thing and looked and said, "Whoa, I see what is that word doing in the middle of the page?" And then they went and looked and saw that, like, all of the words that matched that pattern were replaced by that, and they, were able to get it reprinted and sent out, like, by the 5 o'clock deadline. And I'm like, yeah, that's why we're all reading.
Yeah.
In the very least, we maybe can't trust technology for that kind of stuff.
And
Well,
I will say the other piece of that solution I want to point out that's very important is there's establishing new patterns, but then there's also giving yourself time to think, because those bad patterns show up when you're hurried, rushed, thinking quickly. And you only have so many decisions in a day that you can make carefully. It's called decision fatigue. It's just a thing. But you can exercise caution in how many of those, let's say they're 10, where you spend those 10.
yep.
um, and then the other thing is, as you do things like meditate or present or mindfulness training, kind of flexes that muscle a little. So maybe tomorrow it's 11. But that's the other thing that that we can work on to make better decisions.
That's great. Well, while we were chatting, a few more questions came up, and we still have 13 minutes. So I'm going to try and get through these 4. Jessica identified herself, so I'm going to see if she wants to ask her question directly to you. Jessica, you're live with Dave.
Hey there. I was just wondering, as soon as I turned this webinar on and my husband kind of peeked his head in the door, he was like, I love this. I want more of this. And I was thinking the same thing, which is fantastic. So well done. But also how, besides reading your book and checking out your podcast, what are some solid resources to begin with? I of course love a free online course, but what are some of the things that we could use as resources?
Sure. So we will be sending out an email with a whole bunch of resources, but off the top of my head, like I said, Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow is sort of like the Bible of cognitive bias. And like the Bible, it is very long. If you're looking for a shorter read, Dan Ariely's Predictably Irrational is sort of like a crash course in behavioral economics, which is cognitive bias by another name. And it's a nice, fun, quick, light read. If you're into podcasts, I have a podcast called the Cognitive Bias Podcast. If you want like little short bites for a more like meaty podcast, there's You Are Not So Smart, which is a fantastic podcast that goes into, it's like my podcast, but he's got sponsors. But it's really good. It's really good. And then that video I mentioned at the beginning, if you want to watch something about this, Irrespondent's Gender Equality by Design is a fantastic crash course in like the intersection of bias and design. So I highly recommend that as well. But all those resources will be in the email we send out.
Yeah, I was going to recommend your podcast as well. So that's great. Thanks for the question, Jessica. I'm going to go to I'll just go in order then. An anonymous question: do you have an example of a time when you convinced a client to ask for less personal information? I have an answer to this, but I want to hear your answer first.
You should go, because I've never been able to do that. So you tell me how you figured that one out.
Okay, and I think this is in reference to the interface, around interface talk that you were having around asking for personal information. So I do a lot of consulting with MBA programs for some of their capstone courses, and often it's around research methodologies. A lot of these programs, the students defer to surveys because they're students and they don't have a lot of time to do interviews and stuff like that. We try to encourage them to do interviews, but we'll review a lot of their surveys. And the mistake that folks who haven't done a lot of research, survey-based research, the first mistake that they make is they ask every demographic question they possibly can when they're putting a survey together. And this causes all kinds of challenges. It causes a challenge of lengthening the survey. Like the longer a survey is, the less likely it is for people to complete it. That's the simplest part of the challenge. And the one thing that I do with them, and I do with clients when they want to ask all this demographic information, is I ask them, what are you going to do with this information when you collect it? Because if it's just going to sit there in a database and you're not, there isn't a good reason for you to spin the data to look at different demographic groups like that, then I would take that data out. And often we'll have conversations around sometimes sometimes the data that you're asking for is an analog for something else, and that there may be a good reason or a bad reason for that. So we were doing one for a nonprofit organization, a very large survey in the Philadelphia area, every zip code we were hitting, and they wanted race data. As we kept talking about that, we determined that wasn't really that important, but or the racial information they were gathering really wasn't that relevant to the research that we were doing. And we also recognized that in the city of Philadelphia, if you really need to go back and look at racial information, then just by the way that the way that people have grouped themselves and live in Philadelphia, that the zip code is is a fair analog for that. So we were able to eliminate questions out of that. And the other part of that is that we were, because often folks are responding to surveys, when they hit the race question, they're like, oh, I'm either not going to answer it, or I don't really want to do with it. Like, what are they going to do with this data? And what's going to work around that? So the big question, anonymous attendee, that that you asked around like examples of getting clients to ask for less personal information, is to specifically ask them, what are you going to do with this? Because often they're just curious about that data, but there's no action they can take after it. And that allows them to pull more personal information out. I can't tell you how many times I've had a debate with these students when I say, well, rather than ask age, just ask birth date, because you can calculate age out of that. Because you're asking birth date anyway, so just take birth date, and that will, because they'll put age ranges in, but every organization uses different age ranges, so age range isn't as useful. But if you have birth date, then you can always calculate age range and that kind of stuff. So I don't know if that helped at all, or if Dave, you have other
no, just that whenever I see age ranges on any kind of survey, I'm like, I feel judged. Yeah. Depending on where they've cut it off, it's like 45 to 60 or something. It's like, oh, I just made it, or oh wait, really? That's what you think of me? You know?
Yeah, when I was young, I always felt judged, and now that I'm old, I feel judged. Like there's like from the ages of 20 to 40 is probably when you're not feeling judged, but you know. Okay, another question. When you're using cognitive bias as evidence to support design changes, has that usually been enough? How do you supplement it to convince stakeholders?
I mean, so when I've kind of explicitly brought up cognitive bias, I'll be perfectly honest, like people seem to like that. They like the idea of the scienciness of it, and they're like, because it feels like a competitive edge. So the most honest answer is I usually haven't had much trouble like arguing for that per se. I think where it's come into play has been more around, well, okay, what I will answer along with that is firsthand evidence. Like one of the most convincing things, because we do a lot of research, and often we record that. And part of that is just to have the ability to go back and review later, or have other people listen in to it later. But one of the most powerful examples of this I saw was a project I worked on that had like 15 biases going at once, because you had all these little silos and tribes at a very large organization. And people who were convinced that this particular kind of content they were putting out there was just vital to their jobs. When we played one of their key users, literally, and not just showed a quote, but you could hear their audio playback of just how much of a pain in the ass that content was. It went a long way, right? And it was actually, this was less scientific because it was one quote. It represented a lot, but it was one quote. But that one quote, hearing it aloud in a room full of people, went a much longer way than any amount of science I could quote around like scanning patterns and F patterns and whatever. Like that wouldn't really, actually hearing a human being that you're beholden to saying the thing that you think is awesome is really causing them a problem. Like it makes you rethink your life choices.
Yeah, that's great. And you touched on like how I would respond to this question, or the thoughts that I had around the response to this question, which is a mantra that we have at Think Company often is research breaks ties.
Yeah.
So the idea is like if you're all debating whether you should take a design or something that you're working on in a certain direction, then that's the whole reason why, well, one of the many reasons why we do research. And let's go out and investigate this. Let's put together a really good research study and figure out what the right direction is to take that. We're getting low on time, so our last, and I feel bad, it's Mary Beth. She's a good friend of the firm, but and she didn't have a question. It's more of a comment, which I think is a great comment. It would be interesting to investigate how magicians make use of cognitive bias. And I will say this, like, when you were listing resources that people could go to, there's the video of the gorilla, the people playing basketball, the gorilla walking through the room and things like that. Like this gets into sort of not so much cognitive biases, but other cognitive challenges that we have around being able to pay attention and multitasking and things like that. And that was produced by I forget what the researcher's name is, but his YouTube channel, I believe, is called Quirkology, and he has quite a few really interesting challenges that do overlap magic as well. So Jessica, when you were asked that question about what other resources out there, you might want to look into Quirkology as a tool. But Dave,
Yeah,
last thoughts on this, since
yeah, I'm trying to remember the name of it. Like, to be honest, like when you do this, enough people will be like, "What's the name of this bias? What's the name of that bias?" And the last thing I remember is the name of the bias. But I did an episode on this, and specifically talking about the girl experiment, and it's called selective perception or something like that. But it's like once I've told you to pay attention to X, anything else that happens is really hard to pay attention to, even if it's something like a gorilla walking through the frame. The other thing, since you brought up magic, the other resource I would sort of bring up, if you're interested in this, Mary Beth, is called, there's a documentary called Merchants of Doubt. And it's about sort of the industry of talking head pundits over the past 30, 40 years, whose job has been to go out and talk all science-y about one particular agenda or another, right? That one corporation or another wants. And they intercut it with a magician, like doing what they do. And you actually learn a lot about exactly the question you're talking about, of like how bias plays into distraction. Because that's really what 90% of what a magician is doing, is making sure you're looking over here while they're doing something extremely obvious over here. And they do actually show you one example where he does reveal to you one trick he does. And it's one of those things, once you see it, you can't unsee it. It is painfully obvious what the trick is. But that's how these things work. So yes, it is very much about the selective perception kind of bias, and it is very much about distraction. Can I get you to look over here just long enough so that you don't see this pretty obvious thing I'm doing over here?
Yeah, and we'll have to pull that in. Someone named Karishma just shared a link to that documentary, and also doubled it up on chat. So Dave, thank you so much. It's always great to have these conversations with you. I think a lot of folks, we still have 21 people left. So just for those who are still with us, that's a terrible way to word that. But anyway, for those of us who are still online, I'm going to just share a final screen, and this information is in chat as well. So thank you all for attending. We're going to send a follow-up email with links to everything. We'll definitely throw the link to that documentary in there as well. And there'll be a link to the recording, so you can share this with your friends for them to listen. If you want to give us any feedback on the webinar, again in chat, there's a link to filling out a quick 2-minute survey. I don't think we're asking a lot of personal data in there. If you want to actually chat with Dave and sign up for a virtual coffee, then we're offering virtual coffees as part of these webinars. Sign up for Dave's, the mailing list for Dave's book. That's in the link around Dave's book list. We want to make sure we get to see some of you at Confab. It's very exciting to see you virtually there. And if anyone's interested, please sign up for our Why Your Design System Isn't Working webinar next week. Thank you very much, Dave. I don't know if you have any final words. But,
no, and if you are considering Confab, I'm giving a completely different talk there, so you don't have to worry about doubling up. And I am the least of the reasons to go. There's so many great talks there, and there's still time to sign up, so definitely check it out.
Yeah, it's going to be a great event. Well, thank you, everyone, and we hope you enjoyed the talk.